Good afternoon to all of you. My name is John, and it's a privilege to be invited to come and share some of my thoughts and experience on this topic of engaging the culture Christians in the public square. When I Ching extended the invitation to me, I told her that I wasn't sure if I was the right person to speak on the subject, and the only qualification I claim to have is that I've been involved in political activism with one of the opposition parties for a number of years after graduation, and I've also ran for office 2 elections ago. That was my maiden foray into full-time politics. But because of the political sentiments that were very much in favor of the ruling party at that time, I wasn't successful. Right now, I'm back into the legal field because I actually did law in university. But I'm still involved in the party at the local constituency level, supporting the elected representatives. Okay, first and foremost, when we talk about involvement in the public square, we have to understand what is the basis for us engaging in the public square. First and foremost, our involvement in the public square stems from the cultural mandate, i.e., to influence every sphere of life for Christ. And we have to work for the common good in line with our Christian duty to love God and our neighbors. So that should be our primary motivation in getting involved. And Abraham Kuyper, a Calvinist and theologian, as well as one of our former Dutch presidents, said, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine." And I'd like to point you to two important documents which affirm the importance of social political engagement as part of our Christian witness. The first is the Lausanne Covenant on Christian Social Responsibility. Section 5 states, we affirm that evangelism and social political involvement are both part of our Christian duty, for both are necessary expressions of our doctrines of God and man, our love of neighbor, and our obedience to Jesus Christ. I think this is a very important statement because I think for quite a long time, evangelicals have tended to place evangelism on a higher level, or rather given more priority to evangelism, and have somewhat neglected social political involvement as part of the Christian witness. Okay, there's also this Micah Declaration on Integral Mission, which says integral mission or holistic transformation is the proclamation and demonstration of the gospel. It is not simply that evangelism and social involvement are to be done alongside each other. Rather, in integral mission, our proclamation has social consequences, as we call people to love and repentance in all areas of life. And our social involvement has evangelistic consequences, as we bear witness to the transforming grace of Jesus Christ. If we ignore the world, we betray the word of God, which sends us out to serve the world. If we ignore the word of God, we have nothing to bring to the world. Justice and justification by faith, worship, and political action, the spiritual and the material, personal change and structural change belong together. As in the life of Jesus, being, doing, and saving are at the heart of our integral task. So here is an affirmation that social political engagement it's also an integral part of holistic mission. because usually our understanding of mission tend to be quite narrow. But if we look at mission and understand it in the broader context, we see that mission does not just encompass evangelism, but also involves involvement in the social and political sphere of life. And basically this Micah declaration is motivated by the injunction to do what the Lord requires, based on Micah 6 verse 8, which says to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. And the motivation behind cultural mandate is that basically we want to see a stronger Christian presence in every sphere of public life, whether it is in the government, in education, in the media, or in business marketplace, which LT has touched on earlier. Okay, but the focus of this workshop is more on social political engagement. The term politics, if we define it broadly, it basically denotes the life of the city that we are all part of as citizens, and our responsibility as citizens, of course. And basically politics relates to the whole of life in human society. But if we understand it more specifically, politics refers to the science of government and is about gaining power for social change. Thus, politics is concerned with how we order society for the collective good of all its members. And politics is about promoting social structures that make it easier to do good and harder to do evil. And this can be achieved through setting up institutions and laws and formulating public policies that are well thought out, just and equitable for the good of the public. And politics that is public spirited or motivated by a sense of public service can actually bring about far-reaching positive impact. Paul Henry, the son of Carl Henry, who was a politician himself in the States, he said, "The Christian community must learn to recognize that civic involvement is in itself a legitimate form of Christian service. To deny this is to suggest a truncated Christianity which arbitrarily separates the sacred from the secular." So basically, no, there should be no dichotomy between sacred and the secular. So sometimes we have this impression in our mind that politics is it's a corrupt area, and so we don't want to have anything to do with it. But we should recognize that we need a Christian presence in whatever sphere of public life. Okay, let me give you some examples from the past. If we look at the ministry of Jesus, we can see that there is a social dimension to what he did. He preached the good news to the poor, and he proclaimed freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and release for the oppressed. And when Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, that there is a political implication to that statement as well, because he was actually standing up to the Roman kingdom. And we also see in the life of John Wesley and the evangelical revival in Britain in the 17th century. Commentators have said that Wesley was both a preacher of the gospel as well as a prophet of social righteousness. And the revival movement that Wesley and his colleagues were part of was instrumental in abolition of slavery and reforming society. Examples of which would be improving work conditions, humanizing the prison system, making education available to the poor. And all of this had actually brought about many wonderful changes to the British public. And of course, William Wilberforce had been mentioned earlier. He was the main advocate of the abolition of slavery and also reformation of morals. I wonder how many of us know that Wilberforce was also instrumental in setting up the SPCA, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So these are some of his contribution during his time. And of course, when we look at the American civil rights movement, people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks come to mind. Next, let us consider what is the relationship between the church and state, or how we as citizens should relate to the authorities. Firstly, let us understand that the government is a God-ordained institution. Okay, and government has been set up for the purpose of maintaining law and order, to uphold good and punish evil, to promote freedom and justice. This we can see in Romans 13. Hence, as a general rule, we as citizens ought to submit to the authorities that God has established. But sometimes there are instances where the state may have exceeded its mandate and sanctions evil and make it impossible for Christians to obey God. Then should we still submit to such a government just because Romans 13 says we should? Or can we say that because the authority has usurped its legitimate power, and therefore there is reasonable grounds for resisting or for not obeying such government, especially in Revelations 13, where we see how the state has become the incarnation of evil. So in such circumstances, we should be more careful in whether we should still submit to the government or we should make a stand. And in a modern democracy, the governing authorities are bound by the Constitution. We have a Constitution which prescribes what the authorities can do or can't do. The authorities are not free to act according to their own whims and fancies. And if the state has acted in contravention of the Constitution, it should be called to account for its actions. Okay, all of us are living in a democracy. It may not be a perfect democracy. Some will say that in Malaysia and Singapore, the democracy we have is more of a pseudo or a semi-democracy. And we do not have all the fundamental rights such as in the Western countries which have more developed democracies. Reinhold Niebuhr says that man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. That is why in a fallen and imperfect world, democracy would be the best option. I'm sure all of us would prefer to live in a democracy rather than in a totalitarian state. That goes without saying. And the essence of democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay, it is the people which actually gives legitimacy to the government of the day, through elections. And as citizens living in a democracy, we have the opportunity to participate meaningfully in the public square by exercising the rights given to us by the Constitution, i.e. freedom of speech, expression, assembly, association, etc. And as citizens living in a democracy with constitutional rights, we have the privilege of making a difference, of speaking up. And again, Paul Henry says, we are called to seek justice for those of us who are involved in the public square, to let our light shine, to be the salt of the earth. Involvement in the political process is one of many ways in which the Christian community can be faithful to the redemptive power of the gospel. and our democratic institutions afford us the opportunity to effect change and promote wholeness within our society and between the nations. To forsake this opportunity is to bear responsibility for the consequences of our inaction, as well as to leave the public sector solely in the hands of those who may not be sensitive to Christian values. So by being involved and engaged in the issues of the day, we have the opportunity to bring our Christian values to bear upon society. For instance, in formulation of public policies, or speaking up on an issue that is close to our heart, for instance. So considering that we have the opportunity to be involved, not doing anything would not be an option. No failure to be involved in the public square would undermine our Christian witness. Roy McClory says, when Christians fail to participate, they give the impression that they are concentrating on their own piety to the exclusion of any real interest in the quality of other people's lives. Such silence is a massive vote for the status quo. Ironically, it is usually such people who, when looking at the standards of contemporary society, see decadence and the need for change. The double irony is that their silence has contributed more to society's decadence than the thousand supposed conspiracies such people constantly seem to see in the world of politics. Isn't that true? As a general observation, how we sometimes lament publicly about lament privately about some of the wrongs and ills that we see in the society, but we are probably not brave enough to voice out in public what we privately lament. Those coffee shop talks that we sometimes indulge in. I think especially those of us who are in middle class, we may be very comfortable where we are, and although we sometimes not like what is happening, but we do not dirty our hands, and we do not get involved in helping to change things, turn things around. So there ought to be no room for apathy and indifference. And all that is necessary, Edmund Burke says, for evil to prevail is that good men do nothing. We just fold our arms and not get involved. Edmund Burke also says, nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. Sometimes we think that, I'm just one individual. What can I do that can make a difference? But if you have 1,000 individuals who think that way, wouldn't that be a pity? Because imagine if that 1,000 individuals were to get involved and be part of the change, they would actually have a really great impact on society. So at the more practical level, perhaps we can ask ourselves, what can we do as citizens, Christian citizens, wherever we are, whether in Malaysia or in Singapore? Well, none of us can do everything, all of us can do something, right? First and foremost, I think all of us recognize the importance of being informed about issues, being aware of what is happening around us in society, what are some of the burning issues of the day. And I think it's fair to say that the mainstream press may not tell us everything about what we need to know, and sometimes the reporting is skewed towards the ruling party. So I think being informed about issues is also to not just read the mainstream press, but also to read other sources of information. And I think in our time, we have a lot of alternative websites that give a different view, blogs that allow more honest and frank conversation to take place. So we can be involved in this dialogue and conversations that are happening. And secondly, all of us should register as a voter and exercise our right to vote, especially for the younger ones. Just a show of hands, how many of us have not registered as voters? All of us have. If you have reached the age of 21, we should all register as voters. Especially in Malaysia, it is quite shocking to know that there are at least, I think, 4 to 5 million young Malaysians above the age of 21 who have not registered as voters. Either because they couldn't really be bothered about the state of the country, or maybe they are disillusioned about what they can do. So I think it's important not to be disillusioned, but to have a more positive mindset and to exercise our right to vote, because that's where we actually speak up through the ballot box. Thirdly, we should also pray and uphold those that God has actually placed in positions of authority. The king, the prime minister, ministers, members of parliament, those who hold public office, including judges, lawmakers, etc. And I think for quite many years, I think the Malaysian church, for instance, I think has tended to support the status quo. And sometimes when in church settings or during prayer rallies, they will just be praying for the government of the day, but they do not, in a sense, recognize, for instance, members of the opposition that are equally elected by the people, because they are also part of the governing structure that has been put in place. So we should actually be praying for all these people, regardless of what political affiliation they have. And fourthly, we can also, as citizens, express our views by writing to the press, or to a state agency, regarding a public issue that we are concerned about. Yeah, I think in the press we see daily people writing letters on various issues, and once a while when I scan the papers, I do see certain familiar names of Christians who have also written to the press on an issue that they feel that's important for them to speak up. So that is a very good avenue where we can make our voice heard. And fifthly, we can even go further by lobbying our elected representative to bring up important public issues. I wonder, those of us who are here, how many of us actually know who is your elected representative of the area that you belong to? Do you know who that person is? And have you actually got to know who your elected rep is? And was there a time when you were not happy with something and you wanted your elected representative to bring up the issue in the parliament or in the state assembly? So these are some of very practical things that we can do, simple things like that. 6, we can also take part in peaceful assembly. I don't know whether in Singapore you have peaceful assemblies, but in Malaysia we do. And of course, over here, any public gathering needs to have the approval of the police. In fact, the Police Act says that any public gathering where there's I think 3 or 4 people present, requires a public permit. So imagine if you have a group of people who are gathered in public, you need a permit, which is actually quite ridiculous. But of course, no one has actually challenged the constitutionality of such a provision in the Police Act, because some would say that it is unconstitutional because it goes against the freedom of assembly, which is granted by the Constitution. And some would say that if you want to have a peaceful gathering, just inform the police. You don't actually need their approval as such. And of course, I'm not advocating that we should have public assemblies all the time, but there are times when the situation may demand it. For instance, think in the Malaysian context, there have been such public assemblies which has actually made a lot of difference because it expresses the people's stand, what they feel about issues and what's happening in the country, how the government is running the country, so on and so forth. And I think it's fair to say that some of the public rallies have actually contributed a lot to the change that we have seen here in Malaysia. For instance, the march by the lawyers to Putrajaya, which is the federal capital of Malaysia, on the issue relating to this video clip that has a lot of implications on the independence of the judiciary and judges. And of course, not long after that, you had the mass gathering by this group calling themselves Bersih, which was actually advocating for free and fair elections, because that was an important issue of concern. Because if you don't have free and fair elections, then basically your vote is being undermined. Okay, what else can we do? At the local level, we can also be involved in the local residents association or your neighborhood watch. Again, I'm not sure how many of us have the time to volunteer in your own neighborhood. It's basically volunteerism. Group of concerned citizens coming together and discussing issues and coming up with solutions, for instance, on how to make your neighborhood a safer place, stuff like that. That's where we can make our Christian presence felt. It's also part of loving your neighbors. We can't love our neighbors if we don't get to know them. Okay. We can also get involved in a non-governmental organization if you want to go further than that. I think there are a lot of NGOs that are actually in need of volunteers to run their activities. Maybe in Singapore the NGOs are more well funded than the ones we have in Malaysia, and in Malaysia especially there are a lot of NGOs that require volunteers, people to help out in various charitable efforts, because a lot of times we spend most of our time being involved in church ministry, so and we do not actually give the same level of importance to being involved outside the four walls of the church in society, where I think the Christian presence is much more needed. Or if you feel that there is a political party that shares your aspiration and ideals of what the good governance is or how the government should be run, you can also always become a member of a political party, and they need people too, especially those who are in the front line. More often than not, they really find that they are lacking in a lot of resources. Some of the members of parliament or elected reps that I know, they are stretched most of the time because the demands are so great, and some of them I think they honestly want to make a difference, where God has placed them, but they actually need people to help them, for instance, in writing speeches or doing a research on some issue, or maybe attending to a complaint by one of their constituents, or help out in activities. They organize, like for instance, dialogues with the local community on security, or on other issues like public health. So there are so many different avenues that we can get involved. If you look at the bottom below, is actually the fourth picture, a photograph of two pastors who lend their support to a candlelight vigil on the Internal Security Act. I think most of us would know about the Internal Security Act. Some have said that the ISA stands for I Simply Arrest. And we all know that the ISA has been used as a political tool by the ruling party to stifle dissent and to clamp down on the opposition, mainly those who express views that the government do not agree with. They are always perceived as a threat to public security, which is most of the time is unfounded. So there has been this vigil that has been going on for about half a year, and various people, including the Christian community and Christian leaders, have actually taken part as well in this vigil. So I think that is really a good witness, in the sense that the Christian community, the non-Christians can see that the Christian community also takes seriously this particular issue. Okay, we have talked about what individuals can do. What about the church? The church, I think we are all agreed, should not take any sides, but the church should be politically non-partisan, being politically concerned, yet not taking any sides, not supporting any particular political party, but encouraging its members to be concerned about what is happening in society, and encouraging them to be involved in public debate. What the local church can do is to affirm members who are seeking to make a difference in the public square. For example, Christians who are involved in politics or working with NGOs. I think a lot of times those who are actually involved at the front line, they do struggle a lot, and they felt that sometimes it's quite a lonely journey for them, because they do not seem to have the support of their churches. At least a number of Christian politicians have actually expressed that publicly in church forums. And I think that is one area where the church can actually play its part by giving moral support and encouragement to these people who are trying really hard to make a difference out there. And it's not easy, because in the public sphere you face so many challenges, so much opposition, and so much resistance sometimes. For instance, Wilberforce, as LT has said, spent virtually his entire political career trying to abolish slavery, and that took many long years of advocacy, of persuading the public, and it's a long battle. And that's where the church, the community, can come aboard to encourage these brothers and sisters of ours who are trying to make an impact out there. And at the national level, the church can also and should make a stand on public issues through umbrella bodies such as the National Evangelical Christian Fellowship, or the NECF as we call it in Malaysia, or the Council of Churches. There is an umbrella body of Protestant and Catholic churches which now and then will issue public statements on what the church stands for on a particular topic. I think a lot of times basically the church has responded on issues that affect the rights of the church directly. For instance, on religious rights, difficulty in getting places of getting public places of worship, or restriction in using the word Allah in some of the Christian publications, which recently was an issue which the Catholic Church has faced. They could not use the word Allah in their publication. Although previously the government allowed it, but this time round the Home Ministry actually said, no, you can't use it because it may confuse the faith of the Muslims. So that is where the church through umbrella body can actually state its position. But I think also that the church needs to be more broad-based in expressing their positions on public issues, not just focusing on issues that directly affect the church, but also on issues that affect the public at large. Because this is where the church can show itself to be concerned about a whole wide range of issues and not just issues that affect them directly. Next, the Christian community can also make its voice heard through para-church groups. And one example is the Malacca mandate, which is a Christian-based public interest advocacy seeking to transform society through justice, mercy, and humility. I think the setting up of this group of Christians who are concerned about public issues was motivated by this injunction in Malacca, and is also directly related to the Malacca Declaration that we read earlier on. And this is one avenue where different Christians who are involved in different issues, they can actually come together for discussions. It's a fellowship where they can actually support one another in what they are doing. So in this group you have pastors, you've got Christian leaders, you've got human rights lawyer, you've got different people from different backgrounds working with NGOs, working with the government, coming together as a united body, to formulate strategies and to also identify what are some issues of concern that the church needs to respond to. You can actually check out their website, themaikkamandate.org. Okay, this is just a sampling of some Christians who are involved in the public square. I thought, I'll just give you some examples, some faces. The person on the top left is Ngekuham. He's actually he's a member of the Democratic Action Party, who was elected as the second person in the Perak government. Of course, we know the crisis that the Perak government is undergoing. He in fact had contested in many elections but lost. But this time round, he was successful in the elections, and he actually had the opportunity to be part of the state government. And I think this is really an opportunity for a God-fearing Christian to be involved in the running of the government. But of course, things have changed now. And we also have Teresa Kok, I think, who is quite a well-known political personality. I think before she went into politics, she actually was wanted to be involved in full-time Christian service, but God had given her a different calling of being involved in the public square. I think she has spoken up on a lot of issues relating to women's rights. One of the initiatives that she pioneered was setting up a single mothers support group at her constituency, where she got funding from the Ministry of Women Affairs to run camps and workshops for single mothers. Next, we also have Hannah Yo, who is one of the youngest elected representatives in the state of Selangor. If you have the opportunity to read her testimony, it is actually very interesting because she just got married 3 months ago before she was asked to contest the elections, and it was like a baptism of fire for her. But that was the calling that God gave to her, and I think she and her husband, Ram, has actually made a lot of difference in the community where they are staying, and their testimonies have actually been publicized in various Christian magazines such as Asian Beacon. And I think she represents one of the younger generation who is concerned about making a change in society and actually getting involved. We also have the top right corner, Tricia Yo, another young Christian lady who was who was actually heading a think tank and is now working as a research advisor for the Chief Minister of Selangor. We also have Irene Fernandez, who runs a NGO that focuses on the rights and welfare of refugees. And bottom right, another Christian lady, Ivy Josiah, who heads the Women's AIDS organization. So, not just men, but the women themselves, many good examples of sisters who are actually making a difference out there. Next to her is Dr. Denison Jayasuriya, who was formerly a pastor but went into social research. He was heading a think tank that researches into issues of poverty affecting the Indian community. And I think about 2 years back, he was also made a commissioner of the National Human Rights Commission. So it's a recognition of some of the good work that these people have been doing out there in the public square. Then we have also Maximus Ongkili and Bernard Dompok, elected representatives from East Malaysia. Bernard Dompok, in fact, had been rather vocal in highlighting the issue of the ban on use of the word Allah. I think there were not many members of the cabinet who actually spoke out publicly, but he was one of those who were vocal enough to actually say that that there should not be a ban on the use of the word Allah. But of course, it takes courage to make such public statements. Bottom left is Edward Lee, who also happens to be the elected rep for the area where I'm staying, and I'm also volunteering at his service center and part of his committee. Edward is another person who has an interesting story. He was involved in the NGO at the local level for many years. In fact, he used to be a managing director of a shipping company. But when he was about 30 plus, he actually quit his career and went into full-time social service. He was also involved in the Malaysian Care, which is a Christian parachurch organization involved in social services. By the last elections, he felt that there is a need for him to do more, to be more visible and to take on larger issues. Hence, he actually contested in one of the state seats and managed to win, and is now a representative in the Selangor state government. So it's wonderful to see that we now have quite a big Christian representation in the various state governments and also in parliament. And finally, we also have J.B. Jeyaretnam, who is a well-known opposition icon in Singapore. I think he needs no introduction, and he's the only Singapore Christian politician that I could find a photo on. Hence he's there. And I think all of us would know the long and hard struggle that he had to face in his many years of political life, the issues that he spoke up, and the consequences that he suffered. So there's always a price that one has to pay when trying to make a difference in the public square. No, it's by no means easy, and all of these persons that we see up here all has their own story of how they have struggled, how they have actually worked to make a difference, the obstacles that they have had to overcome. Okay, I think I'll just quickly run through some of the challenges that are facing. This is probably more relevant to the Malaysian context. Some of the issues that as Christians we should be concerned about and speak up on would be corruption. I think in Malaysia corruption would be it's a more severe problem than what we face in Singapore, and there is a need to actually combat corruption at all levels. I think realistically we will never be able to eradicate corruption, but at the very least we can minimize it by making it more difficult for the corrupt to engage in acts of corruption, by exposing their misdeeds, so that to instill fear in others that they will not do such corrupt acts, make it more difficult basically for corruption to take place. And there is a need for an independent anti-corruption body to really address this issue of corruption. And of course, in Malaysia, another big challenge that we face is to fight poverty and to alleviate the living of the poor and marginalized. I wonder how many of us know that the income disparity between the rich and the poor in Malaysia is actually one of the highest in Asia. And if we do not address this disparity, I think in the long run it's going to affect the structure of our society, the stability and national unity. Thirdly, there is also a need to ensure that our civic institutions are independent. The police force, the judiciary, the media, and especially the election commission. They should act fairly. Sometimes we refer to these institutions as the government service, when in fact it should be the civil service. When we use the term government service, it seems to imply that they are obligated to the government of the day rather than to the public, which would be more correctly described by the word civil rather than government service. And I think also in Malaysia, at this point in our nationhood, race relations is very fragile, and there is a need to improve race relations and foster national unity, because it seems that the country is more divided than ever before. Of course, the recent the new Prime Minister has spoken up about this very interesting concept called One Malaysia. But it's a good start. But then again, there must be substance rather than just the form of it. Otherwise, it would just be another slogan which will not be realized. There's also a need to promote transparency and accountability. Those who hold public office, they should be made accountable for their actions. I think, unfortunately, one of the sad things about Malaysian politicians is that they get away a lot of the times with misdeeds, and we don't see any minister willingly resigning from their office for some scandal or something like that. But I think with enough public pressure, ministers or those who do not do their job will be forced to be more accountable to the people. And one of the efforts that I think was very positive recently was the Select Committee on Select Committee on Transparency, Accountability, Competency, Accountability and Transparency, which have highlighted some misdeeds involving the previous Chief Minister, and also a charity organization that was set up by the spouses of the members of the previous state government. So although sometimes the law does not allow these people to be prosecuted, but at least when their misdeeds are exposed, it actually does a lot for transparency and accountability. And there's also a need to review as well as to consider repealing, doing away with some of the oppressive laws that are actually unconstitutional and stifle the freedom of the citizenry. For instance, the Internal Security Act, the Printing, Presses and Publications Act, whereby the media actually has to renew their license, their printing and publication license every year. So if they were to be found reporting on issues or take a view that is maybe critical of the government, they'll be warned. So that does not augur well for freedom of information in a mature democracy. And there is also a need to uphold religious freedom for the minorities, especially in Malaysia. Now, one of the challenges we face is ban on the use of the word Allah, which is being arbitrated by the courts now. So it's an issue of concern to the church, especially the Iban Christians in East Malaysia, because for them they actually use the word Allah much more than the rest of us. And finally, another important issue is to preserve the social contract that came into existence when the country was formed, because of late this social contract has been undermined by a lot of public statements about how Malaysia is an Islamic state, and there is a need to defend the Constitution and the rights given by the Constitution, so that the Constitution will be given expression in practice and not just remain a piece of paper. I think finally, while we make efforts to make society more pleasing to God through various ways of creative reforms, at the same time we also realize that we do live in a world that is fallen, and because we live in a world that is fallen, things will never be perfect. Even the positive changes that we make may be undone by subsequent injustices that comes after that. So we always live with this tension of wanting to see changes, and yet seeing that despite all our best efforts, corruption seems to be worse, or there seems to be new problems and new sets of injustice that happens. I think in this instance, the words of C.S. Lewis is very applicable. He says, "I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think and think hard about improvements in our social and economic systems. What I do mean is that all that thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on under the present system. But as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law, and without good men, you cannot have a good society. Change for the better ultimately can only come through changed lives." Think so here we realize that political reforms do have its limit. It's not possible for us to create a utopia, a perfect world, because ultimately man with his sinful nature will still find new ways of getting better of the system. But nonetheless, think political reforms or reforms to the structure of the society are important in itself, because that is where we will have some form of checks and balances. And as we know, we should be salt and light in society. And I think by being salt, it doesn't mean that the food will not go bad. The food will still go bad, but the salt will actually slow down the process of the decay of the food. So I think that is something that we can bear in mind, that even as we desire to see society being changed for the better, but we realize that we can never create a perfect world, at least not on this side of heaven, but we can do enough to at least ensure that things are not as bad as it is. And in conclusion, which LT also mentioned earlier, we live in the tension of the already and the not yet. Although we have tasted, we have been given a foretaste of the kingdom that is to come, but we know that God has not fully ushered in his kingdom. So even as we continue to endeavor to claim every square inch for God, we recognize that everything will be made perfect only when God's kingdom is fully ushered in. Yeah, basically these are some of the thoughts that I have on this subject. I think we have some time for questions and comments.